I'll be honest, folks, I just don't see it. I don't see it. I picked this game up because it got rave reviews. I saw people buzzing about it on social media. I saw glowing critique of it, so I picked it up. I bought it quite excited. And I just don't see it. I do not see what everyone's praising about this. I do not see what everyone loves about this game. At its best, at its very best, Remnant from the Ashes is a mediocre third-person shooter. It's not even all right, it's just there. It's stodgy, it's clunky, visually it's incredibly unappealing. Just drab browns and greys with a little bit of a dull red in there. Dreary, utterly dreary, and like monotonous in tone, and the enemies you fight are just boring tree people, usually the same enemies over and over and over again, and when there is a variant, you'll just see that variant over and over and over again. The combat itself doesn't feel all that great. It feels fine, but you're just shooting the same weapons again over and over. It's, yeah, and that's the game at the very best. It's also weirdly imbalanced, with strange difficulty spikes. For the most part, sections like this in between bosses are mostly piss easy. Too easy. And the bosses represent such massive jarring difficulty spikes, you're surprised it's the same game. And it seems like there's just a bit of ineptitude when it comes to balancing the game. Sometimes it feels borderline broken. And we'll talk about exactly why that's so broken in a moment. But first we'll talk about bosses. I'll show you some boss footage in the video. But basically, the bosses are ridiculous. They're so stupidly designed, because they're all the same in terms of trying to be challenging, in that the bosses themselves have not designed to be challenging so much as they're just surrounded by enemy mobs, just lots of minion enemies. You know how they're almost always the worst enemies in other games, the worst bosses in other games? The boring, lazy boss that has no real strategy to itself, it's just got lots and lots of enemies around it. It's one of the criticisms of several Dark Souls bosses, Dark Souls 2 bosses, to be specific. They were not people's favourite bosses, where it's just, well, here's the main boss, but here's loads of annoying enemies to get in the way, and we'll just throw waves and waves of them at you, and we'll call it a day. We'll say that's hard. That is almost every boss in this game. I spent hours and hours with this thing, and to date, I've not found a single boss that is just a boss. In fact, the winning strategy for this game when fighting bosses is to realise that the boss isn't the threat. That's just a long health bar. You take pot shots at the boss if and when you can, because the only challenge in a boss is waves and waves of enemies. For the most part, some of the bosses themselves are quite challenging as well, while being backed up by waves and waves of enemies. When it comes to giving the player an obstacle, Remnant's whole philosophy is to stack the worst, most infuriating ideas on top of each other to contrive a sense of difficulty. Not to be actually difficult, to contrive a sense of difficulty. You're looking at a boss now. This is actually one of the lesser bosses in terms of utterly irritating the piss out of me. But it's still backed up by endless waves of little ads, just little monsters. And it has a giant, devastating area of effect attack. Area of effect attack. For some reason, I cannot say that today. I've done several takes of me trying to say area of effect attack, and I've messed every single one up. But anyway, you can have a look at this boss. I'll describe another one to you, right? This one took the cake, and it's not even the worst one on the menu, but this is the one that convinced me that I'm just not going to get on with this game ever. Basically, there's this boss, and I'll show footage of it. I've showed footage of it at the beginning of the video, but there's this boss that has area of effect attacks, devastating ones, right? Also, it can spawn poisonous explosive area of effect attacks. That's what it can do on its own. It then endlessly spawns minions that have their own poisonous area of effect attacks, and then Halfway through the boss fight, it decides to spawn a completely different type of minion that just does damage, alongside the poisonous explosive minions that it is still spawning, alongside its poisonous area of effect attacks and its regular area of effect attacks. And it just does them over and over again. You try reviving an allied player under that scenario. You can try. You might even do it if you're lucky enough. But between all the explosions and the poisons and the little enemies and the big attacks, it's you just want to grab the game and yell, pick one! Pick one! Or two! Pick two of these ideas. They're all annoying, they're all the worst, they're all cheap, unimaginative ways to be difficult, but you don't need all of them at once. But that's the game for you. Not once does it try and be clever, at least in the hours I've spent playing it. Not once does it try to be clever or imaginative. To be honest, it's a bit pathetic. The game's boss fights are pathetic in terms of their complete creative bankruptcy, if I'm being perfectly brutally honest with you. The game's creatively bankrupt. It just comes up with the laziest ideas in terms of trying to challenge the player. And when it's not doing that, like I say, it's piss easy. But let's talk about what adds to this difficulty. And again, it comes down to being unimaginative. The game's balance for co-op is thoroughly broken. You see this boss I'm doing here? We're getting downed. There are lots of mobs, lots of little enemies, just like you'd see here, just getting in the fucking way. I went back and did this boss solo. I encountered it solo, did it again on my own. It went down like wet tissue paper. Piss easy, like I said. Thorough, like a cakewalk. But when you go on co-op, not only does it increase the enemy's health bars to extreme degrees, it also ups the amount of enemies that spawn alongside the boss. Again, to extreme degrees. I wonder if they tested the co-op of this co-op shooter. It's positioned to be a co-op shooter, but a lot of people I've spoke to who've played this have said the same thing I've said. It's recommended to play it solo if you want to actually get through it without shitting blood in frustration. And that does not seem like a well-designed co-op experience to me. The idea that the game is such an extreme difference between playing it on your own and playing it with friends. I don't get what they were thinking. I do not know what the developers were thinking when they thought, I know, we'll bump up the health to that much. It seems like something that ought to be patched. It seems like something that was an accident that they didn't, because I truly mean it when I say the balance is broken for co-op. I shouldn't be facing enemies that are a total breeze solo and feel like the most aggravating thing in the world when I'm joined by more than one player. If you're playing it with two people, it's passable, but still quite a heavy bump in terms of difficulty. The moment you get to 3 or 4 players, forget it. Just bloody forget it. It's a nightmare. But anyway, even without that, it's a mediocre shooter with vague trappings of Dark Souls style design. You know, you've got checkpoints that act like bonfires, that restore your health and everything, and respawn all the enemies. The bosses are behind fog gates. That's subtle. And there are some, like, at times I see what they're going for. Like, I quite like the idea of a third-person shooter action game with these Souls-like elements. I quite like the fact that it's got an upgrade system for your guns and for your armor. You can find, like, cool costumes out there. That's all fine, but it's all set in such an unimaginative, trite post-apocalyptic world with an awful colour scheme and enemies that do not spark the imagination in any way. Remnant has the foundations of what could be a very interesting cooperative third-person shooter, but it's so lacking in creativity that it's just not there, and I just don't see it. Oh, and before people say get good, waste of time, they're already saying it. Before people say that, I got through it. I got through the bosses that were pissing me off, but I just don't want to play it anymore, so I've stopped. You know, when you beat a boss in Dark Souls, the feeling is elation. Or at least for me, I feel triumphant, I feel awesome, I'm like, that was a brilliant fight, and I feel good for getting through it. Every boss I've beaten in Remnant, I do not feel that. I just feel, oh, well, that sucked. That's my response. Always. Oh, well, that sucked. On to the next one, I suppose, until I just decided, no, not on to the next one. Because Dark Souls encourages me to keep playing it. It feels exhilarating to play it. This just feels like a slog. For many reasons, this game's a pedestrian chore to get through. If you're gonna pilfer from Dark Souls, if you're gonna pilfer from one of the best, understand what makes it one of the best, and have better ideas than lots and lots of enemies. That's what arcade games did to suck quarters out of people. It was already an old, tired, cynical idea in the 80s, mate. Anyway, that's Remnant. I do not get what people are so excited about with this one.
This shit finna suck.